Yeah, welcome everybody to MidCurrent Interviews Live, where we talk to expert anglers, authors, and personalities and give you a chance to ask them questions in real time. I'm Marshall Cutchin, publisher of MidCurrent. Today we're joined by Nathaniel Linville of Key West, who is a multi-species saltwater record holder and fly shop owner. Nathaniel opened his store in the angling company in Key West on Simonton Street in 2009, and since then he spent a lot of time fishing the lower Keys and South Florida. Nathaniel has, by my estimation, I think by most people's estimation, become one of the most dedicated and technically proficient saltwater anglers in the world. He most recently set a new 6-pound tippet record for tarpon at 140 pounds, which is really extraordinary. Before we start, I wanted to remind you that we're watching live on you're watching live on Facebook. You can comment and you can add questions in chat. We'd love for you to ask questions about permit fishing or tarpon fishing or whatever, bone fishing, anything you want. And please also, if you're watching, invite your friends to join. If you're watching this as a recorded version, welcome to you as well. So, Nathaniel,
Yes.
what's the most fun day of fishing you've had recently?
That's a good question. I fished a day maybe a month ago with. It's hard to pick. I fished a day with John O'Hearn maybe a month ago, where we caught a big tarpon and a giant permit, and then we caught a mutton snapper on the flats. And that was probably, and we could not for the life of us find a bonefish to catch to complete whatever kind of slam that would be. And we just had a good time.
I think that's a super grand slam.
It might have been, yeah. If we had been able to catch the bonefish, it would have been something. But it was great, and we had a good time. And we were actually looking for the mutton snapper, it didn't just happen to us, which made it feel like somehow more premeditated. But yeah, it was a really fun day for sure. Marshall, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm back. I was going to say, just catching a mutton snapper on fly these days is quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, there's not many of them around like there used to be, from what I hear, and I've not seen it, but it was fun to be looking for it. And of course, everything on the flat, I was, delighted in telling John that 3 Barracuda was a school of mutton snapper, and but cool. We saw this thing and we caught it, and it was a lot of fun for sure.
When did you first get interested in fly fishing?
I got serious about it about 10 years ago. With the opening of the shop, but I've been doing it my whole life. My mom got me into it when I was really little, and it was never something that I can remember not doing. We started freshwater fishing and then got into saltwater fishing probably in the early 90s. And I've just been doing it ever since.
Were your first, you caught some saltwater fish before you moved to Key West, though, right?
Yeah.
Lived in the Northeast?
Yeah, striped bass and bluefish, and what we call bonita, but our false albacore. Or no, what we call albies, which are false albacore, which is called bonita here, and green bonita, and the occasional bluefin tuna, but that was not. We had to move around I was in Long Island Sound, so we had to go up to like Cape Cod or Massachusetts to find those.
Gotcha. So permit is one of your favorite fish to fish for. Steve Huff calls them a dishonest fish. What do you think about that?
It's funny. I think that permit on a per shot basis are pretty honest, actually. If you look at a day of tarpon fishing where you get, 20 or 30 shots, 50 shots, and you hook I don't know, 5 to 6 or 7 of those fish. That'd be a really good day of tarpon fishing. If you had 50 shots at permit, I think you'd probably hook more. I mean, it would depend on, look, if you're counting every fish in each school that you throw at as a shot, which I think some people probably do, or each time you throw into a school, you multiply the number of times you throw by the number of fish in it, and the shot number goes way up. But per sort of opportunity, there's a group of 3 permit, and that represents one shot. I think, yeah, they're pretty unrelenting. If you do something wrong, they'll not tolerate that. But I don't necessarily share that opinion. I think that permit, if you really do everything right, chances, like the few times that I do everything right, if a fish doesn't eat it, I tend to think I'm really confused about what went wrong. And it leads to that sort of I can't, you're racking your brain to figure it out. Whereas if I throw a fly at tarpon and it kind of turns away and it doesn't want it, I think that's actually much more normal behavior for tarpon. But you don't have those opportunities with permit. You can't just go out early or stay late and find a school of tarpon that are feeding at night and just throw a big black fly in there and hook one. Permit are harder to do that with, but I think they're pretty honest. I mean, they're frustrating and they do drive you a bit crazy, but I don't think that they're I don't think you can do everything right very many times before you hook one.
Yeah, and it's hard to say what where the reputation that permit developed came from. And certainly, 30, 40 years ago, when people were throwing tarpon flies and, even designing permit flies from tarpon flies, the expectation was that if you caught a fish on fly, permit on fly, it was about 90% luck and 10% skill. And somewhere along the way that changed. And now the fact that tarpon, in fact, probably see more flies than they've ever seen before, and they live to be such a long age. It's almost like the deck has been reshuffled to some degree.
I would agree with that. I also think that, to your point, the technology that we're using, permit flies have come a long way, and so have tarpon flies. But I think there was a time in the 80s and 90s where, if you go back into the 80s, the permit flies didn't even sink. And if you give 10 people sort of a little white feathered streamer and you say, go try to catch a permit, I would say that luck would factor into that a lot. I mean, I've thrown a lot of tarpon flies at permit and I've only caught one of them. And so I think that is more luck. But yeah, the technology has changed, and I think people are unsurprisingly figuring out how to catch them more effectively. But again, I gotta run those numbers sort of per shot. If I go out and you tell me I'm going to get 10 shots at tarpon today, and another day I go out and you say you're going to get 10, shots at permit, and these are all going to be high quality shots, I would actually feel more confident that I would bring to hand a permit than a tarpon. Because once you hook a tarpon, now you got to fight the thing. And I mean, you can get 2 bites, 3 bites, 5 bites from tarpon, and they all fall off on the first jump. Right. And I mean, so in that way, it's interesting. If you look at the frequency that permit are caught in the permit tournaments and weight fish are caught in the tarpon tournaments, I'm not talking about a small fish where you touch the leader or something, but a fish over 70 pounds brought to hand. Those numbers are pretty equal. Like what it takes to win a 3-day permit tournament or a 3-day tarpon tournament, it's the same number of permit or weight fish that it takes to win it. And I've always found that to be an interesting statistic, and it speaks to the fact that permit are not as dishonest as everyone. I mean, what's dishonest about tarpon is when I had this happen to me the other day, you throw a cast and the fish comes up and he eats the fly, and you set the hook really hard, the fish turns away and you're clearing the line, and the fish jumps and the fly falls out. To me, that's dishonest. I don't
Right.
like that at all. Like there of course there's a lot you can do to hedge that, but it still happens. But the number of permit that I've lost once they were on the reel is very, very low. So that in that way, I think permit are actually pretty honest. They don't jump, and you don't have to like drive the hook into their mouth. Once you're tight to them, if you stay tight, you're likely to bring that fish to hand.
So as long as we talked about fish behavior a little bit and how it's changed. What in general do you think has changed about Keys fishing over the past 10 or 15 years?
I mean, I think the number of boats that are here in tarpon season has increased a lot. This is probably a longer conversation, but the number of people that are here for a brief period of time and tarpon fishing specifically from say, February through June has really exploded, and it changed the fishing on the ocean a lot. And that would be, I think, the biggest. I mean, there's trends, but I think that's been the biggest shift that I've seen in my time here. And it's a tough thing. I mean, I have my own feelings about it. I'm sure people that are doing that as guides have their own feelings about it. Neither one of us is probably right or wrong. The answer, I'm sure, is somewhere in the middle. But it definitely is the amount of stress on the tarpon here during tarpon season on the ocean is it grows as their numbers grow, and it grows, I think, more than their numbers do. And it changes their behavior, and it makes it harder to catch them, for sure.
Well, since we're encouraging people to ask questions, I'm going to throw up a question here from Todd Tanner.
Sure.
A little bit out of order here, but Todd asks, other than practicing my casting with a heavy rod, what would a trout angler like myself have to do to prepare for my first saltwater trip to Florida?
So there's a couple of things. I mean, the advice that I would give you, Todd, is casting practice related. When you're trout fishing, you have a really long amount of time between seeing a fish rising and casting to that fish, if you're dry fly fishing. And I think that the time frame is really compressed in saltwater. So what I usually tell people to do is pick a target. I give a lot of lessons in the park, and there are these sort of bald patches where there's no grass, and practice throwing on the left side of that target, on the right side of the target, and then short of the target as if it was coming at me. And if you can get to the point where you can do that, I think you'll have a better chance. The other thing is that most people, when they're casting, they have sort of a favor. So if I'm facing this way, my easiest cast, and I think most people would agree, would be sort of at 11 or 10 o'clock, where I'm casting sort of this way, diagonally across my body. And it's easy when people are practicing to really practice with that sort of plane relative to them and never change it. So another thing that I tell people to do is practice casting you can either change yourself, so like clock your body around relative to that plane, or you can just change the plane relative to yourself. Because if you're on the bow of a boat, a shot might be at 12 or 11 or 10 or 9. And the way that I cast at 9 is sort of across my body like this, whereas the way I cast at 12 is in front of me like this. And if the only thing that I practice is casting in front of me like this, when a 9 o'clock cast happens this way, it's really difficult for a lot of people. What they'll find they do is they sort of have to turn and then cast instead of just making a cast across their body. So changing that plane angle relative to you when you're casting it is like a real world sort of thing that happens down here that's difficult to prepare for, and it's sort of under practiced and sort of under discussed.
How much do you think you've caught when you've cast behind the boat or in a spot where you weren't even looking until somebody saw it?
A ton. I mean, and then the nice thing is if you're casting at 9, then you have a really good 3 o'clock back cast. And you can practice that too. You can have a back cast at 1 and then 2 and then 3. the same way you have a back cast at sort of 10 and 9 and 11. So that kind of like shifting the plane relative to your body is really important. I notice a lot of times too, like the boat is stationary, and as the guide is approaching the shot, he's turning the boat slightly, which is changing the angle of the fish relative to the angler. And it's a lot of times someone will start casting, up here. I'm probably doing a bad job. And then as the boat turns, now they're casting over here. They're not adjusting their cast as the boat is turning. And that's something that's really particular to saltwater. And if you're in a trout stream, obviously you're either wading or you're in a drift boat. And it's pretty easy to adjust your position, and then the boat's stationary. So I would say from a casting perspective, that's a really good exercise that has some real import if you're coming down here wanting to fish, because it's difficult to get on board with.
Al Petkus is asking, how far is your average permit shot? 40 or 50 or 60 feet? What about 100? What about 100 feet?
No, not 100 feet. I mean, occasionally. That's like the only time that I would ever throw really far at a permit is if I felt like I had to. Like if a school of fish was coming and I could throw it out way in front of them. If the wind was behind me, the problem is accuracy is, as you contract distance, your accuracy goes way up. So if I'm wading probably 40 feet from the boat, I would say maybe 50 to 70, 40 to 70. But I think Al's right in the range there. 40, 50, or 60 is a good, a really good distance to practice at.
Do you think permit have great eyesight as far as being able to see out of the water? I'm sure.
No, I don't think they're seeing out of the water. I think they feel the boat turning. I think they feel the boat stopping. One of the reasons to wade is, it took me a while to figure this out, but I can stop. If I'm walking towards a fish and I decide that I don't want to, for whatever reason, the fish stops tailing and I don't want to get any, I just don't want to move, I can stop. And stopping a boat, the boat has to come to rest. And when it does that, it's going to decelerate and it's going to put out a lot of, waves in the water, sound waves, exactly, pressure waves. And so I think that more what they're picking up on. I mean, if you, and Marshall, you've seen this probably as much as anyone, but if you put your pole on a piece of hard bottom and it slips off, you can see a fish. It's kind of just, they'll kind of just tense up a little bit. So I don't think they're actually seeing things out of the water. I think they're just really in tune with their environment. And if anything's out of place, they have like sort of a terror alert system. A lot of times when I'm wading, especially if it's calm and I'm walking towards a fish, if I'm worried that fish is going to get away from me, but it's still feeding, like I've come up behind it, which is suboptimal, but I'll purposely throw short of the fish, maybe 20 feet. And a lot of times they kind of stop and they swim right at me. And I just pick it up and make the same cast again. And I've caught a fair number of fish doing that because I think they know that something's there. But a fish like that's not concerned, they don't think you're going to kill them. They'll swim over and I don't know that they're checking you out. I don't think they know what they're doing. To them, they're out in this, suspended in water, and something moves and they kind of come over and look at it. And that happens with the boat too. When a permit spooks, often they'll come right at the boat. And then they really spook,
Good point. Yeah.
So you can use that to your advantage, but I don't think it's them seeing you or seeing, you out of the water. I think tarpon can see out of the water really well. They'll see the fly line in the air, barracuda too, but I think permit are not, I don't think they are built like that, but I'm not a scientist and that's just what I think.
Yeah, but if you look at the fish anatomy, bonefish and permit are you could say sort of built for looking at the bottom or down at, sorting through the seagrass and that sort of stuff. And tarpon and barracuda are a bit more, or tarpon especially, sort of upwardly focused in there.
Yeah. And, fish like a Jack Crevalle in the lights in the docks, you'll see them swimming upside down sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what they're doing is it's easier for them to look down, but they
Interesting.
want to look up, so they flip over. And I think permit are built much the same. So,
Al Petkus asks, what length leader do you prefer? And I think he's talking about permit.
Yeah, I mean, I fish longer leaders, probably 15, 16 feet maybe. But I'll adjust that depending. With a heavier permit fly, you can turn over a long leader easier. And I use a really long butt section. So my permit leader would have 6 feet of 50 pound and then 5.5 feet of 40 pound, and then maybe, 16 inches of 30, and then, call it 20 to 25 inches of tippet, which is usually 16 or 12. And that same leader could be sized down. I do think with a heavy butt section, it still makes a 10-foot leader easier to turn over. There's no reason to just have that long leader. But I feel like, because I don't fish clear lines usually, except if I'm barracuda fishing, so it buys me a little bit of, it kind of hides the whole program a little bit.
Yeah.
But it still works with shorter leaders. But I would say, personally, a minimum for permit fishing is I wouldn't go less than about 12 feet. It just gets really hard. The other thing that can happen is with a short leader, as that cast turns over, it can come tight and then sort of shock back and create a lot of slack. And that's an argument against these really, really aggressive, like heavy weight forward tapers. When you have this thing with a bunch of weight traveling, as soon as it comes tight, if you don't ace the timing to redirect it, it'll come tight and it'll sort of shock back, and then you've got a bunch of slack. And once you start getting slack in the cast, it could be problematic. So those longer leaders help to sort of like flatten that effect a little bit. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if you have a long enough butt section and you just adjust your timing to wait a little bit longer for it to turn over, I don't think they're super hard to throw. I think throwing a really long leader on a trout rod it's much harder than throwing a long leader on a 9 or a 10 weight that's got a long 11 or 12 foot butt section on it.
Yeah, but you're being really conscious of the stiffness of that butt section too, right?
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
Abrupt transition, right?
Yeah, you got to have something that has a similar stiffness to the fly line. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because it'll, you're transferring energy down, and it's not, and we talked about this some the other day. It's not diameter, although diameter and stiffness are often conflated. Like when we were fishing on 2 pound, we used really stretchy material, but it was pretty thick. It had a big diameter. But if you held it like this, it would droop straight down. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was incredibly soft, and you could see the loop traveling, and it would hit that, and it would just kind of like die. Mm-hmm. So we had to throw these really like big loops and try to get it to turn over. Mm-hmm. But if you have a stiff material, which is why I use fluorocarbon, it'll turn over better.
Sure. This kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier with Alexander Wonish, and I apologize, Alexander, if I pronounced your name wrong. But he asks, how successful can a beginner in flat fishing be in the Keys, and what fly casting skill is required?
I mean, that's a good question. My intuition, at the outset of that is that this is a very advanced fishery. And I don't mean that it's advanced like from what's required, but I think the fish have been educated a lot here. But you can be a beginner and still catch fish here. It depends on what kind of fish you want to catch. I think that, it'd be easier for me to answer that question if I knew like what level of beginner someone was. But I would say pretty difficult for a beginner fly fisher to be successful here. Although a beginner fly fisher could come here and hook a lot of different kinds of fish and have a great time. But would they be able to catch a permit? My guess would be probably not. The question about fly casting is a really good one. And I talked before about setting up a target and being able to throw on the left side or on the right side or short of that target. I think if someone could do that, the key is this: if you can start with a short line, so start your cast with 5 feet of line out of the rod tip, and get the fly to the left side or the right side or short of a target. If you could do that at, say, 50 feet or 40 or 50 feet, you can absolutely come here and catch a lot of bonefish and have a great time, and probably catch a bunch of tarpon, or at least hook a bunch of tarpon. And you might even be able to catch a permit. The problem is, a lot of people, when I'm doing casting instruction, they make a cast and they get about 20 feet of line out, and then they pick it up and they start casting again. The key is to be able to make that transition of feeding line out and then delivering it. And it's something that in the years that I've been doing casting instruction, it's very difficult. Even when I tell someone, okay, like, to see where you're at, hand them the rod and say, look, I want you to make a cast at the left side of that white spot, but make sure that you start with a short line, because that's where most people screw up when they're casting, is that transition. And there's so much discussion about it needs to be this number of feet away, that what people forget is you start, for every cast, no matter how long, you start with 4 or 5 feet of line out of the rod tip. And your first couple of motions are feeding enough line out to work with, and then adjusting your timing and presenting the fly. And I would say that transition is more important than sort of some ultimate distance thing. And a lot of people wait too long on those earlier casts, get a bunch of slack in, or they don't wait long enough on the later casts. And I would say, for me as an instructor, that's the single hardest thing that there is for me to teach, which is how to get people to feed line out quickly, and get line out of the rod tip with the cast in the air. And when, advanced casters, they do that, they do a lot of things. They cheat, they kind of drag the rod tip up and they fling it back, and they get a lot of slack, and now they've got 50 feet of line out quickly, and they're able to make a cast. So practicing that transition with an eye toward, picking a target, throwing, again, left, right, or short of it. Those are real world situations. And I would say if someone can do that, even if they're a beginner fly fisherman, if you have a decent guide, they're going to, their job is to make it easier for someone. And they'll make sure that the fish are within a certain range, and that the shot lasts longer than it usually would. But yeah, each person's different, and that I hope that answered the question. I know that's a long answer.
A related question, Al again asks, if a permit dips on your fly in the first shot, doesn't bite and moves on, do you take a second shot at it? And what percentage of takes have you had on the second shot? So that's kind of related to your ability to not just make that first cast, but get ready for what happens next, right? It
all comes down to the definition of dip. If I feel like Clinton here. But it does. It really does. If a permit, I go to fly at a permit, and the permit runs over and looks at it really hard, and then all of a sudden the fly gets pulled away from it, and the fish decides to move away, I'll absolutely throw the fly again at that fish. But if I throw a fly at a fish and it kind of lazily swims over and looks at it and says, no, thank you, I might still throw at it just reflexively, but I think that's a very low probability thing. And I've seen it work, once is enough to do it forever, right? But I don't consider that a very big, I don't think that's a really high probability thing. Now, if there's multiple fish, if there's 2 fish and one fish does that, I'll usually try to keep an eye on the other fish and discuss it with my guide, whoever I'm fishing with, and say, is the one on the left the one that hasn't seen the fly, or the one on the right? And we'll talk about that and try to show it to the fish that wasn't the one that looked at it. But typically, that's a low probability bet. Don't
you think that the average angler, though, has the experience fairly often that they just blow the first shot?
Yeah,
it's just going to happen, sure. Right? Everybody blows shots. The best casters in the world blow shots, but obviously, if your cast is more affected by wind, or you're just more nervous, or whatever it is, I think there are a large percentage of anglers who, I don't want to say they assume their first shot's not going to be bad, although there's some people like that too. But they sort of assume, okay, this may not do it, right?
Right.
Or somebody like yourself might say, I got about an 80% chance of putting this fly about where I want it to be.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think that, I catch a lot of permit on my second cast, and I'd be interested. It wouldn't surprise me if that was like approaching 50%, because I don't know why it is. I think a lot of times the shot sort of develops like that. Again, and back to Al's question, it depends on what if the fish lost the fly in the grass, like if he's looking for it and the fly is in the seagrass, and or turtle grass, and you pick it up and you cast off the grass and you throw again, that's a great opportunity, because now he feels like he lost something. But knowing when to leave it is, I think, as much a part of it as knowing when to throw it back in there. And I have constant, let's call them discussions, with people that I fish with, because I'm a big fan of leaving the fly.
Sure.
I kind of feel like that's my cast, and I'm just going to hold it, for out of some sense of I feel like I'm owed that cast is going to work, which of course is bullshit. But no, I think a lot of times you make a cast that's not right where you want it, but giving it a second and letting the shot develop and seeing what the fish do is almost always the best thing. And if you get sort of yippy and you pick it up and you rip it out of there, then your chances go way down. So yeah, a bad cast is only a bad cast if the fish didn't eat it. I love when I make a cast, and I was with Steve not too long ago, and a fish rolled next to the boat, and he's like, "You're too far away from it." And I was like, Chad was there, and I was like, and I got a bite. It may have been a different fish because I was pretty far away, but
Doesn't matter.
you got to see it through, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Kyle Williams asked, last discussion, Nathaniel mentioned he has used the same fly line for years to permit fish. Which line is that?
Yeah, I use the Rio Tarpon line. It's not their direct core. It's just their standard Tarpon line. And I think the idea behind it is, so that line in the 80s when it was developed was very heavy, because they were throwing really big, heavy, like 5.0 Tarpon flies. And it's overweighted, but all the rods today are much faster than they sort of should be. So the idea is that line is a good balance between, casting in the wind, carrying line, making a short cast, making a long cast. And so it's sort of a B or B plus at everything. Direct core, the new version of the Tarpon line they have is cool. That direct core is like a more, it doesn't stretch as much, which is great, but they have this, I don't know, I hope someone from Rio is listening. They have a giant orange right section in the line, which needs to go away, and then it'll be even better. But the taper is great, but I'm just not a fan of throwing 20 feet of bright orange anything at fish that are, as smart as these ones are. So, yeah, the Rio Tarpon line.
What about permit? And that line's available, right? You can still buy that.
Yeah.
Even though it's been around for a while.
And I use it for tarpon and permit, by the way. I don't change it.
Oh, interesting. What about, speaking of changing things, your flies when you go out permit fishing? And I want to ask you about tarpon fishing too, but
sure.
Do you have, I know I've heard, and I believe it's a true story, that you weigh all your permit flies on a kitchen scale. Do you take
it's not a kitchen scale, Marshall, it's a crack scale.
A crack scale.
But that's okay. There might be children watching. No, I weigh them on a gram scale. Yeah, I do. Oh. And I try to keep them, the same weight. And we talked about this a few days ago, but trying to keep a set quantity of how much they're going to sink and not change that it's part of the whole thing. It's part of knowing what the fly is going to do, knowing what my fly line is going to do. So where I pick up and what the line can do it's one thing to change from a 9 to a 10 to an 11, which is about those are really the only rods I fish anymore, is 9 through 11. But if I start messing around with tapers or changing the weight of flies, it's a whole new amount of information that I have to process. And I'll be honest, it's really, really hard to do that. I was fishing with Ian Slater, who's a guy that I fish with a lot, and we fished tournaments together. And we were messing around with a fly the other day, and it wasn't better or worse. It was just different. And I spent a whole day being really frustrated. And finally, I think we finally had one bite, and I broke it off immediately, which was just a cherry on top of like the worst day of fishing. But honestly, it took a long time. And the next time we fished, I think I hooked another one, and we had come a long way. But it's just very hard. I really don't understand how people make those changes in their gear. Like they're always trying new stuff. I think it's great to try new stuff. And as a fly shop owner, obviously, I buy all kinds of stuff and try it, absolutely. But when it comes to fishing, I think it's a smart idea to consider settling on one thing and sticking with that so that you can know what that one thing is going to do. And weighing the flies came from that. John and I started doing it in 2014. And I mean, to this day, every one of John's flies, he weighs them all. And I kind of stopped doing it because I know what they weigh at this point. But like even before a tournament, I'll weigh every fly in my box and have a little piece of paper on it so I know what it weighs to make me feel better, I guess, at this point. Because you do it enough, you sort of know what they're going to weigh.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kyle Napplebaum asks, how has the fishing in the Keys changed since the hurricanes? I think he may mean the last hurricane, but I'm not.
Not a lot. I mean, this ecosystem is built for it's built for storms. I mean, it was built by storms. So as crazy as that was, it didn't really. It changed some places where it changed like white sand. It made some places bigger. But it really didn't do a whole lot to the fishing. I mean, early on, there was no one down here for 2 weeks or longer, I think. I can't remember how long they were shut out from the Keys. The Keys got infrastructurally pretty damaged.
Yeah.
No, not much at all, actually.
Alexander Wonish asks again, tackle-wise, as a trout fisherman, I do not own too many heavy rods and reels. Where do I start with an all-around flats setup?
I would, the big question there would be if you were going to do any tarpon fishing. There's 3 rods that I fish usually. I have a 9, a 10, and an 11. And I think you can fish pretty much the entire Keys with that. For anything really with those 3 rods. So I use a 9 weight for permit and bonefish. Maybe 80% of the time I use that for permit. When it gets windy, I switch to a 10, and I use a 10 when it's calm for tarpon and an 11 when it's windy for tarpon. So if you take tarpon out of the equation, I would say either a 9 or a 10. And if tarpon are in the equation, I would get a 10. There's some great, like not super expensive rods on the market. Reddington makes a rod called the Predator, which is really nice. I think Hardy is coming out with a new sort of mid-level. They have a rod now called the Demon, which has been discontinued, but you can get a good saltwater rod for a couple $100, like $200 or $300. As far as reels go, I mean, the reel is the thing that's going to fail. And there aren't many good sort of affordable entry-level reels out there, but Reddington makes a reel called the Behemoth, which cast. It's not all machined, so it's poured aluminum and then anodized, and they do some light machining around it to finish it up. But I think that whole setup, I sold one the other day. I think it's $600, $650 probably for the whole thing. I can't remember offhand, but that's I would say, without going too far down the trying to save money road and still maintaining some quality, that's a good a 10 weight would be a really good place to start. If you weren't going to do any tarpon fishing, a 9 is fine. It's a little easier to cast a 9, especially if you're coming from a trout background. But a 10 will also make you, it's lift heavier weights, get stronger kind of thing. So I would probably say get a 10 and use that.
I know a lot of fly shops and other consultants, let's call them, would say an 8 is a fine rod for bonefish, but I've always felt like they're not really taking into, we're talking about one rod, right?
Yeah.
They're not really taking into account the typical daily wind conditions on the flats. And so it's not so much about the weight of the line or the size of the fish, but are you going to be able to throw that line when it's blowing 15 knots in your face or 20 knots in your face?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Well, my dog's making an appearance.
Hey, dog. What's your dog's name?
Cobra. Cobra is a pot cake. She's a pot cake from Turks and Caicos.
Well, there you go.
She probably hasn't had dinner yet, so she's very hungry, which is why she's being so sweet.
Since you mentioned Cobra, I'll ask you about the Cobra Nagel and some of your other knot inventions. I know you're a kind of, I don't know, I call you a knot geek. I don't know if that's fair, but we've talked before about how much of the equation when it comes to leader strength has to do with knots, and I think you agree with me that most leaders when they fail at the knot.
Absolutely.
So I know you spent a lot of time thinking about knots and shock absorption and all that kind of stuff. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I mean, I like knots because I mean, as someone who takes a lot of comfort in things that I can control, which, it's unsurprising given the amount of things that are uncontrollable when you're fishing. I think knots and building leaders and making them really strong is one thing that you can do that really has an impact on how many fish you catch. And I think, and I said this the other day, if you really want to know if someone knows what they're doing, look at their knots. And there's always exceptions to that. There's some, genius fishermen who have bad knots, and it's just, but those people are exceptions and not the rule. But in general, a knot that's properly tied means that you're going to catch more fish. And the people that spend the time to learn how to do it, it indicates a certain amount of presence and involvement in their own success. And good knots, I mean, 16-pound Mason is really, really hard to break unless you do something that you really shouldn't do. In fact, and I use the example of, if you tie your leader to a fence post and it's 50 feet away, at 10 pounds of pressure, it's going to stretch at 10%. So if you're standing and if I hand someone a rod and say, stand there and try to break it, they can't. And it's not because they're not strong enough. It's because, and this is actually something that in sort of this discussion has been lost. The reason that they can't is not because they're using the rod inefficiently. It's because there's no physical way that they can take up that slack. And the only way they could do it would be to break the rod. What you can do is you can bend the rod, but at a certain point, the rod's going to fail. And you have to take up 5 feet of slack, which you just can't do in that situation. So even if you walk straight back, 8 or 10 feet, that's when that's going to break. So if you don't, once you have access to that kind of strength, you really realize how hard you can pull on these things and what you can get away with. But if you're breaking off fish, I mean, breaking off fish on 16 or even 12, it's really hard to do. And there's something going wrong when you break material. And I don't have any leader material here, but if you break it, it comes out all curled and torn up, and it's got all these weird angles in it. It's not straight. And I think that if you're not seeing that kind of effect on your leaders when you break a fish off, it means that a knot's failing, or you can tell, right? Because the knot's there and the tippet isn't, or your clasp was this long, and it was, that's where the fly would be. But yeah, the
Sure.
knots are going to fail. I mean, 99% of the time, unless it's a bimini in there. Like when people tell me like, oh, I broke off, some fish the other day, and I said, well, what was it in the class? And they go, yeah, every one of them was in the class, and I know they're not tying a bimini twist. Like, I don't buy it, and I don't want to cast stones, but that just doesn't happen,
Right.
because the knot will fail unless you really go to great lengths to make it 100% of the time. So that's what I think about that.
Gotcha. Alan Farago asks, has the let-up in fishing pressure improved fishing conditions since the Keys were shut down?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's we're all talking about it. It's absolutely affecting. I mean, it's hard to say how much it's affecting the fish, like in terms of whether or not they bite the fly. I mean, I think a lot of their learning is sort of cumulative. And I was a little bit disappointed to find out that like every fish wouldn't run over and eat my fly. When I started doing some more fishing since the shutdown. But what the main difference is it's a lot easier to find a place to fish. You can move around. Whereas again, like I was saying earlier, on the especially on the ocean for tarpon, you have so many people here that are just here for a few months and they're taking up spots. And the sort of the way you do it is you take a spot and you got to kind of live with it, often for that whole day. But the ability to move around means you can sort of go check this place and run over here. And I think that the fish are a lot more relaxed. But they're not like, it's not like they've never seen a fly before. I mean, they know what you're doing. And if they figure it out before they make a mistake, they're not going to make that mistake. The main thing down here that I see is that we don't have the cruise ship, sort of silt of the harbor every 3 times a day. And there's a lot of work that we're doing now to try to curtail the cruise ships down here. But that's the main difference that I've seen is without Northwest Channel getting torn up. I mean, a lot of these boats have 8 inches of draft between them and the bottom. At the dredge. So they're kicking up not just a little bit of silt, but a lot. And, I understand that people make a living on cruise ships, and that's fine. And I don't hold that against them. But when that starts to affect, the natural environment and the lives of bunches of guides and anglers, and personally, I do think that's something we have something to say about it. And we're getting ready to say a lot about it down here right now.
Yeah, that's a highly laudable endeavor. And
Agreed.
I would encourage anybody who has an interest in helping with that project, which is it's a happening thing right now.
It is.
Sort of a culmination of many years of people being concerned about what cruise ships are doing to the bottom and to the coral reef and everything else. Can we suggest they reach out to you, Nathaniel? Would that
please do. There's a website, and I want to make sure I get it right. So I'm going to look it up on my phone here. It's safercleanerships.com. At this point, we need registered Key West voters to be a part of the fight. We're at the stage now where we're collecting signatures to get some referendums on the ballot. But yeah, if anyone who's watching is a registered Key West voter, reach out to me directly. I'm easy to get in touch with. And if you want to help, go to that website. Again, I have to look it up because I never get it right. Safercleanerships.com. Yeah, little plug there.
That's great. Thanks for doing that.
Absolutely, my honest pleasure.
One thing I wanted to touch on before I let you go today, and that's the whole idea that you came up with of talking about the hardware versus the software.
Sure.
In flats fishing.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's I mean, in general, the idea is that there's as much improvement to be found, sort of mentally and in terms of non-physical preparation as there is in using equipment and gear and getting technically proficient. I would say as I would say more work that I do these days is on the sort of mental aspect and maybe probably the emotional aspect of fishing as well, in terms of like preparation for things to happen and taking more things into account. Because when I'm throwing a fly at a fish, I mean, I have one rod and I have one reel, and my setups are, the longer I do it, the less they change. I mean, I have a Mako reel on a Hardy one-piece rod and a Rio Tarpon line, and that's usually it. I don't have a lot of different arrows in my quiver. But given that the shots are going to happen in ways that are unpredictable, and that most of my time is going to be spent waiting for a fish to sort of show up. And then the amount of time that I have to really perform in, even in an 8-hour day of fishing, is, I mean, not very long. So that software term that you brought up is one we've been kicking around down here for a while, which is what can I do and what can anyone do to sort of be prepared mentally. And I was talking about earlier with someone that wrote the question about, what can I do to practice? Something as simple as practicing, turning the plane relative to them. That is a physical thing, but that comes from an awareness that might happen. And understanding how the wind affects your cast. I mean, once you have the ability to make a cast, whether or not you're able to make it when it matters becomes sort of, in my opinion, pretty close to the only thing that matters. I mean, you and I have talked, Marshall, before. If you look at the last, say, 5 permit tournaments that have happened down here, the winning casts were not some crazy like backhand, curve hook cast. I mean, they were probably, regular shots at 40 to 80 feet. But being able to do that under pressure and everyone's, this is the buck fever thing. This is falling apart when there's fish involved. So I think that preparing for that and trying to work on that becomes really, really important. And I think, honestly, it's in a lot of ways, it's more important than, what line or what leader or what rod. I mean, a lot of people fish different things. There isn't a whole lot of agreement about what rod is best. And I've been selling tackle for a long time, and a lot of people prefer different rods. There is no right answer to that question. But I think everyone does benefit from sort of a presence of mind and thinking about what's happening and being ready for, performance under a really limited amount of opportunity to perform. And a lot of that time spent waiting, I think people can, I find myself tuning out and just being conscious of like, okay, what's happening here? Where is a fish likely to be? Where's the guide not looking? Where might a fish be? Or asking my guide, like, hey, I don't really know. Like when I fish with Steve a lot, we're in these basins and bights and up in rivers. And, the current there is really difficult to figure out because it's not, on the ocean here, like outgoing goes out towards the ocean and incoming comes in. But I find myself asking him constantly, like, which way are the fish going to be facing? Because I know that the chances are we're going to see like a little blush of color. And if I don't know which side of that fish the head is likely to be at, that's a 50% chance that I can, be throwing at its tail, which is never a good thing. So I think that's sort of what that idea is a preparation to sort of perform. Yeah.
And I think maybe you have to have a little experience to understand this, but we've talked about this before too, that if you see a school of tarpon coming at you from 200 feet away and there's 15 or 20 or 50 happy fish in it, and they're coming right at you, it's a lot harder to make that cast, believe it or not, than it is to a fish that pops up at 10 o'clock, 50 feet away, that's moving. It's actually technically a harder cast to make, but the execution of the cast is so much easier.
Yeah.
When you're kind of surprised and you don't have that time to think, get your brain all roiled up and tensed, and, start worrying, all these worries come into your head, you start that feedback loop, right?
Absolutely. Or I mean, I think back, this is going back a couple of years, I was fishing with Ian, and a giant permit. I mean, the thing was, of course, I didn't catch it, so of course I'm free to say it was as big as I want, but suffice to say it was a monster. And, threw a cast and the thing ate it, and the line wrapped around the platform and it broke off. And it was just, I mean, we both knew it was likely to be the biggest permit that we'd, probably maybe catch in our lifetime. It was giant. And, there was very little discussion about it. It was just get ready and forget about it, put it out of your mind. And a minute later, 2 fish swam by the boat and we caught one. Now, granted, it was still a shame to lose that big one, but, and I think that's an argument for what makes tournament fishing really hard, is that those losses hurt more when you're in a tournament. My mind starts to go to that thing was probably X number of inches long. But being able to erase that stuff and be prepared and sort of ready at all times without carrying the sort of frustration forward, I think that helps me catch more fish because I don't think that I'm the fish that I catch. I'm not doing some crazy ninja move. I mean, it looks really, I mean, it's a 50-foot shot, but knowing when to make it and knowing, how to process that stuff mentally, I would say that probably, if there is a difference in me now versus me, say, 6 or 8 years ago, I'd say it's mostly that, because I'm not presenting a fly to fish much farther away. I'm just more prepared and more calm and ready to perform at this. I mean, an example that I use is if you're standing at the baseline and that eight times in an 8-hour time on the baseline, a ball's going to come over the net and you've got to hit a clean winner back. I mean, most of your time is spent waiting. And that's sort of being prepared and being ready for that at all times, but also in a way that's sustainable. I mean, you can be totally amped up and ready for an hour, but can you do that in hour 7 or 8? I mean, you got to think
Sure.
about future planning, as it were. I think that stuff, the more I do this, the more important I think that stuff really is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll have to continue that conversation because I'm really fascinated by that whole idea of mental preparation, and I think the more you fish in saltwater, especially if you're sight fishing like you do on the flats and the keys, the more you appreciate how being ready influences your success rate. Yeah. Well, Nathaniel, we're running out of time here. Is there anything else that you want to talk about today before we wrap it up?
No, I think we've covered it. Unless anyone has any more questions they want to have answered.
We did have John Conch ask about West Coast surf perch, but I'm guessing that's not in your.
Go for it. My advice is go get them. Send me pictures. That's
always good advice. Well, thanks a lot for your time today, Nathaniel. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in to MidCurrent Interviews Live. We'll be continuing our broadcast in coming weeks. Hopefully, we'll have Nathaniel back and we can dig into a little bit more detail about saltwater fishing. Until next time, try to find some quiet water somewhere and do a little fishing.